Today we will have a look at how we can use the VCV VST inside Bitwig. They work really nicely together. We will have a look at sequencing from Bitwig, sequencing from VCV, like recording, Midi, modulation, automation, and more. And I want to start with a short introduction before we start with all of the examples. I also have a video, by the way, about using the VST with Ableton. If you are interested, links in the description. But when you buy the so-called VCV Pro with the VST version, I have it here in the favorites, you will get two VSTs. One will be the VST instrument and one will be the VST effect. So you can also process sounds and use it as a send effect, for example, within Bitwig in this case. So let's load, I will load the VST. This is the window. Of course, we can also resize the window, which is quite important when dealing with bigger patches. It will load your template. This is my template in this case. And you can also save your projects, save your patches within VCV. Of course, they will be saved with your Bitwig projects as well. But you can also save and open and try different patches from within VCV. Now, in this video and when working within a DAW, there are a few modules that we will use more often. So first of all, the first module will be the Midi to CV module. This will convert the Midi that's coming from Bitwig into CV, basically signals that we can use within VCV. I will try to keep this video as beginner friendly as I can. So basically it will convert Midi from Bitwig into control voltage, into signals we can use inside of VCV, like pitch, for example, like gates, so when the instrument should play, like velocity, like clock, which is basically the BPM coming from Bitwig. Right, another module we will use will be the CV to Midi, which will do more or less the opposite. It will convert the signals from VCV Rec into Midi that then we can use within Bitwig. You can see already by default it's set to DAW, so by default it will be connected to Bitwig. And another module that actually has a few different variations are the audio modules, right, that we can use to send basically the audio from Bitwig into VCV and the audio from VCV into Bitwig. We will also look at multi-track recording. So let's really start with basic sequencing. Okay, so let's have a look first at some basic sequencing before we move to something a bit more advanced. Here I have VCV, an instance of VCV with a simple voice. I have here Plets, also known as the macro oscillator 2, going through some delay. For now, the delay is all the way down. I want to show you how to sync the delay with the BPM of Bitwig, and this is going through some reverb. Now, I also have here already a MIDI clip, right, with a few notes programmed, and I want the notes from Bitwig to sequence this voice in VCV. So again, the main module we will use is the Midi to CV. This will convert again Midi from Bitwig into signals we can work with in VCV. One of those signals is, for example, pitch. Now in VCV and UREC, pitch is most of the time called volt per octave, which is this one here. So I'm going to send the volt per octave output from the Midi to CV to the volt per octave input of Plets of the macro oscillator 2. And I also want to tell this voice, or I want Bitwig to tell this voice when to play, and this we do with the gate signal. In this case, it will go to the trigger input of Plets. This will tell Plets, or this voice, when the notes are played, right? And now I want to get the audio from VCV into Bitwig, and for this we will use the audio module. In this case, it's the audio 2. It has 2 inputs, 2 outputs. So I can send the left and the right, 2 channels, left and right, into Bitwig, left and right from the reverb in this case. Right, and now when I hit play in Bitwig, right, we have the voice. It will be sequenced. Right, now I can choose maybe to take all of those octave down. Right, maybe stay something like this. So now we have pitch and we have also the gates, right, when the note will play. Now I have here the delay again, and I want to sync it with Bitwig to have this to be synced to the BPM, to the clock of Bitwig. And for this we have two outputs that we can use. We have the clock output. This will basically output the BPM from Bitwig without any changes, which might be a bit too quick. This is mostly used to sync other clock modules within VCV. We will have a look at this also in a second. But we have also the clock divided by a number output, and in the right-click menu of this module we can choose divided by what. We can choose the clock resolution. So now it will output quarter notes. I can divide it to or multiply it to output 8th notes or 16th notes, 32nd, and also clock resolution. So I will leave it at quarter notes for now, and this will go to the input of the sync input of the delay, and now this delay will be synced to Bitwig. So if I bring it in, right, I can change the delay time. Right? So now we have the delay synced to the BPM, to the clock from Bitwig. Now we can also use something like velocity, for example. Now velocity, usually you know it as a controlling a level or volume of a signal, but since we are dealing with a modular environment, VCV is fully modular, we can use velocity to modulate anything basically. So I will use this, in this case, to change the timbre of this voice. Right, now if I use something like for example, the randomize device from Bitwig, and I choose to randomize the velocity, right, we will have also randomized velocity. Sometimes the voice will be brighter, sometimes it will be darker, and again, all of this is coming from Bitwig, is being sequenced by Bitwig. So let's have a look now at something a bit more advanced, and I want to start by showing you the sync from Bitwig with VCV, how we can sync VCV to Bitwig. So in VCV I'm using a clock module. This is clocked from Impromptu. It works really well with external clock signals for syncing, and I'm using the clock signal as I showed you before from the Midi to CV module. Basically it will output a clock resolution of 24 pulses per quarter note, 24 ppqn. So this is going to the BPM input of clocked, and I have the clock resolution of clocked via the mode selection here set to 24. And as you can see, it's set to 125 BPM, which is exactly the same BPM I have set in Bitwig. And if I hit play, you can see that it's rock solid. It's not going anywhere. It stays at 125. So the sync is really tight. And already you can hear that I have a sequence going on. So I'm using again the same voice more or less. I'm using plats, again through a delay and some reverb, and I have here a Midi clip, right, that I'm using to sequence this voice. And what I have in VCV, I have the velocity again modulating the brightness of this voice, and in Bitwig the device I'm using is again the randomized device, which is randomizing the velocity, but I'm also randomizing the pressure, which is in VCV called aftertouch, right? So I'm basically randomizing this parameter, and this, since again it's modular, you can use it for anything. I'm using it to control the velocity, the actual level volume of this voice, through a VCA, which is basically a VCA is a module we can use to control amplitude of signals. So in this case, it's controlling or changing the volume, the actual volume of this voice. Right, so this is already something we can do, just like we saw before. What we can take this even further, if I stop this for a second, we can also sequence VCV rec polyphonically. So here in Bitwig I have another clip. It's basically playing one note, but of course this is Bitwig and it has many interesting devices. So I'm using the multi-note device, as you can see here, to convert this one note into a chord, a 4-note chord. And this is going into VCV rack. Again, I'm using the Midi to CV module. Right, and in the right-click menu of this module, we can choose how many polyphonic channels we want, how many voices of polyphony we want. In this case, because I have 4 notes, I chose 4 channels, so now I can send polyphonic signals in VCV rack. By the way, if you want to know more about polyphony in VCV rack, there will be a link in the description to a video I made all about polyphony in VCV rack 1, which will work more or less the same in VCV rack 2. And I will also make a dedicated video for VCV rack 2. And this is sequencing a module called interzone, which is also polyphonic. So basically I can sequence chords, right? So if we listen to this, right? So now we have also chords, so you can also sequence it polyphonically, and I have also some reverb, Valhalla Supermassive, just for fun. Right, now we can also sequence drums, we can also sequence percussive voices. Right, so here I have another Midi clip set with a few different notes, and in VCV rack I have some drums. Again, I'm using Plets as my drums. Plets can do many things, and the module we use for this is called the Midi to gate. This one will convert the Midi from Bitwig into gates we can use in VCV rack. Now there is something to keep in mind here. I'm not so sure it's a bug. It was the same also in VCV 1, in the last version of VCV. It works the same also in this version. The notes are an octave up in VCV rack. So here you can see I have in the Midi clip, I have C1, but here it's set to C2. I have D1, here it's set to D2. So you will have to take the notes in VCV rack an octave up, and they will correspond to the notes in Bitwig. It works the same in Ableton, and again, it worked the same also in the previous version of VCV rack. Right, so now if let's solo this and I will play the drums. Right, I have here a sequence. Of course, again, this is Bitwig. You can add ratcheting and all sorts of different probability notes. Right, but something interesting this module has, again, in the right-click menu, it has velocity mode, which means that the velocity from Bitwig will come out through the gates, and you can see this here on the scope. You can see that some of the gates are basically lower in level, right, and the other gates, and this you can use also to control or to change many things. Some of them you can use also for velocity, for basically for the level of the signal, so you can change also velocity, right? So let's listen to everything. Right, so we have chords, we have a sequence, we have drums. Here I have a simple bass, right? I have here a Midi clip, again with some notes. And in VCV rack I have just a simple FM voice, right? And again I'm using the Midi to CV to send the pitch and to send also the gates. And this will sound like this. Let's have a look now at basic automation. Here I have some Midi notes and I have VCV rack, just like we've seen before, being sequenced by this sequence. Right? And now I want to have automation, for example, for the wavetable position of this oscillator, right? Or the decay of the envelope. Right, so all we have to do, I can open the automation lane here in Bitwig, right? And now I just have to touch the parameter I want to automate. So if it's the decay, you can see here it's changing. If it's the decay, if it's the wavetable position, right? And now I can basically go ahead and write automation for it, right? So let's say something like this, right? And now you can see it here also moving in VCV rack. And we have automation. Let's do the same also for the decay. So I will add another lane and I will click the decay. You can see it changed. Right, and now I can go ahead and write something. So let's do something like this. Right? Right, so it's really easy to write also automation and automate different parameters in VCV rack. So here is another example. Here I have a sequence going with the even VCO and the filter here in VCV rack, and I'm automating the frequency of the filter and the resonance of the filter. If I hit play, right, you can see this also here on the screen. This is the automation. Right, adding rhythm to this voice. I have here also some drums, just for context. Here I'm using drums from Bitwig. And I'm also arpeggiating a voice with the arpeggiator from Bitwig in VCV rack. Right, this is the voice, and as you can see, I'm automating. Let me open here the automation lane. I'm automating the volume, the velocity of this voice, which will sound like this. Okay, let me show you now how we can route audio from VCV rack into different tracks in Bitwig and basically multi-track record the different voices from VCV rack in Bitwig and process them differently. So here I have a sequence going. In this case, I'm using a sequencer in VCV rack. Right, sequencing a voice going through some delay, and now we need to send this audio into Bitwig. So I will need an audio module, and again we have 3 versions of it. We have the audio 2 that has 2 channels, audio 8 has 8 channels, and audio 16 has 16 channels. So we can send up to 16 mono signals or 8 stereo signals or voices from VCV rack into Bitwig for recording and processing. So I'm going to use this one here. Right, and now I'm going to send this voice to inputs 1 and 2. Right, now we already get sound. This is not what we want. I don't want to have this sound coming from the instrument track. I want it to come from an audio track for recording, so I add an audio track. This MIDI track or instrument track I take out of the main output. Basically here we can choose where it will go to. So I click here and I say no output. Right, so it's not going anywhere, not to the main output, we don't hear it. And there is something we have to do, and I believe this works only in Bitwig Studio, so the full version. Right, here we have the multi-out settings. So any VST like Contact, for example, and VCV rack that have multiple outputs that you can send outputs to different tracks, you will have to set it up here. So if I click it once, I can add the missing chains, and it will automatically add the 16 tracks that we can use, 16 channels from VCV rack. And now in the audio track, instead of stereo input, I can set it to VCV rack 2 chains, and then I can see here I have output 1. I can choose pre-fader or post-fader. I will go with post-fader, and now I have to change the monitoring to in. Right, and we have this voice from VCV rack going out to outputs 1 and 2, and this is being routed to an audio track that is receiving from 1 and 2. If I want to do this differently, I have multiple voices, we will see this in a second. I want to send it to outputs 7 and 8, let's say. Right, so I send it to 7 and 8, and then in the audio module I have to choose again VCV rack 2, VCV rack chains, and then you can see it's already here, 7 and 8, and then we have this. So here I have something a bit more advanced. As you can see, I have multiple voices here in VCV rack, multiple sequences, and in the audio module you can see I have again the audio 16, and I'm routing the first voice to outputs 1 and 2, the second voice to 3 and 4, and the third voice to 5 and 6. Again, I have everything here set with the multiple outputs, right here, just like I showed you before. So if, for example, I solo the first track, the first audio track, it's called the FM operator. This is basically this voice here, right? And I hit play. I get only this voice, only this sequence from VCV rack, and as you can hear, I have again only on this track I have Olala Supermassive, so only this voice is being routed to one audio track and being processed separately. And of course you can also record this, multi-track record the different voices. I have here another voice, right? If I mute this for a second, right, I have here another voice, a sort of an arpeggio. Again, it's coming from the same instance of VCV rack, so you can have one instance and send it to different audio tracks and multi-track record them and process them. Right here I have a sort of an arpeggio, and I have here unfiltered audios silo, right, and more supermassive, of course, right? So I also process them differently. And I have here another one, which is a bass, this one. Again, in the same instance of VCV rack, just sending them through or into different channels. Right, also here I have different processing, some distortion and more supermassive. And I have here also some drums just from Bitwig, just for fun, so we have some nice drums here. Now let's have a look at how we can sequence instruments in Bitwig from VCV rack, how we can record those sequences, and how we can send modulation from VCV rack to Bitwig and from Bitwig to VCV rack. So here I have the basic Sec3, the so-called basic, not very basic sequencer from VCV rack. Right, I'm sending pitch information basically through a quantizer. And I want to have this sequencing here, the polysynth from Bitwig. Right, so the module we will use is the CV to Midi module. It will convert the virtual control voltage, the signals from VCV rack into Midi we can then use in Bitwig. Right, so I'm going to send the pitch information again to the volt per octave. This is basically in VCV rack and Euro rack. This means most of the time pitch information. And I also want to use gates to tell the polysynth when to play, right? So I'm going to use the trigger output from the sequencer. Now here there is something we have to keep in mind. Let's start with this first, and then I will show you how we can fix the issue you will see in a second, right? So now what we have to do, we have to make sure that the polysynth is receiving this Midi. So here the CV to Midi module, I can see it outputs from channel 1. So in the polysynth, I'm going to change this to channel 1, and the input will come from VCV rack and devices VCV rack, and change the monitoring to input. And now when I hit play, there is something, let me take the attack here down. Right, there is something playing there, but the issue is, it's not really an issue, it's just how things work. The trigger coming out from this sequencer and also the trigger that will come out from the clock, the BPM output from the Midi to CV module that we saw before. Those are basically just really short triggers. It's just like hitting a key on your keyboard and letting go directly, which means that it's not enough to trigger this synthesizer. So one of the solutions we can use is, there are many solutions of course, but one of them is the module called D-Gate from Bog Audio. We can use it to convert those triggers into gates, into longer gates, and then we can use, let me show you this really quickly on the scope. Right, so those are basically the triggers we are getting, right? And now if I send the signal first, let's say that this will be the yellow trace. If I send the signal first through this module, through this D-Gate, I can lengthen the gate, right? And get different results. So this now will go to the gate of the CV to Midi. I hope it makes sense. And now we have sound, right? So now again we have this sequence from VCV rack, right? This sequence going through the quantizer just so it stays in a certain scale. You can also use the quantizer from Bitwig, of course. Right, and this sequence is now sequencing the poly synth. Now what if I want to record this sequence? I just arm this track for recording, right, and I start recording. Let's say that this is enough. Now we have this MIDI saved, right? This MIDI playing from the timeline itself, right? And I can shorten it. I can loop just this section. Now, by the way, we don't need anymore the MIDI, so I just change the input to no input, right? Because we have the MIDI track within the track already. Right, and now we have it recorded, and again we can, right, change it in all sorts of ways. I just edited the wrong notes here. Right, and we can edit the sequence, we can change it in all sorts of ways. So we can sequence and we can also record the MIDI. Now let me show you how we can send also modulation from Bitwig to VCV and from VCV to Bitwig. So I'm going to get rid of this for a second and I'm going to bring back the input from VCV. So again, we have the same channel, input, VCV rack device, right? So now again, the sequence will come from VCV rack. Right, and now what I want to do, let's turn off this looping. Let's say that I want to send modulation from VCV rack, right, and modulate this polysynth. So for example, I have here sample and hold. Sample and hold is basically a sort of a random signal, a stepped random signal that we can use to modulate all sorts of things. Right, so the module we will use for this now will be the CV to Midi CC, which basically converts the signals from VCV rack into Midi CC messages that we can use to modulate almost anything in Bitwig because it's Bitwig and it's awesome. Right, so let's say that I'm sending this sample and hold to CC input number 0, right? It says here 0. So in the polysynth, I can add a modulator that is called Midi. Right, and here you can see we can choose the CC number, how easy and amazing this is. I'm just changing it to CC0, and already you can see that we get the sample and hold signal from VCV rack, and now I can map it to anything I want. So if, for example, I map it to the cutoff, right, we have modulation coming from VCV rack, modulating the polysynth, basically. Right, now we can also really easily use modulation from Bitwig to modulate VCV, whatever might be the reason you want to do this, because there are many options for this in VCV rack, but let's say that this is what you want to do. Let's say that, for example, I want to modulate, let's say that I want to modulate one step, right? I want one step to move a bit, and every time it will have a different value. So all I have to do is click the destination that I want to modulate, and it will be here, it will show up here on the device. Right, again, I can click something else. Let's say the steps. Oh, this is interesting. Let's modulate the steps. I just click the steps and you can see that it's here. Right, and now, again, because it's Bitwig and it's awesome, we can just add modulation to this. So let's say, let's use a sequence, right, steps. Let's randomize this a bit. Right, and let's use this now to modulate the steps. Right, let's make this maybe bipolar. Bipolar is here. Right? So now we are modulating. Let's go to VCV Rec and see this also. Right? So now we are modulating VCV Rec from within Bitwig. And it's really easy, it's really intuitive, and it's fun. And again, here we have something a bit more advanced. Basically, you can use one instance of VCV Rec to send MIDI to different tracks, just like with audio. You can also do this with MIDI through the different MIDI channels. So here, for example, I have a really lovely sequencer also from Impromptu. It's called the probe key. Basically, you can set the weight of the different notes, and it will randomly, according to this weight, play the different notes. So you get more or less a random sequence. This is going to channel 1. Right, and in Bitwig I have here the Polymer voice, the Polymer synthesizer. It's receiving the MIDI, right, again through MIDI 1, through channel 1, and again I have the input set to VCV Rec. So basically now this sequencer in VCV Rec is sequencing this voice. Right. Again, I'm using pitch and the gate. In this case, I don't care about the gate length. It's working right out of the box. Right, I have here another sequencer. In this case, it's polyphonic, so you can also sequence chords. Right, I have here, this is called the note sequencer. By the way, in the right-click menu, you can change the number of polyphonic voices. And this is going to the same, not to the same, but to another CV to MIDI module, and it's just set to channel 2, so you can send to multiple, which is amazing, multiple MIDI channels, right? So this will be this voice. This is the grid here, right? So a modular is sequencing a modular. And again, in this case, I have channel 2. And again, it's set to VCV Rec. Right, now I also have here a bass. Let's listen to this already. I have here a polysynth with a sequence. I sequenced here a bass line. But I'm sending modulation from VCV Rec. You can see this here. Right, in VCV Rec, I have the lovely Befaco. Moog Slicer or Max Slicer, the sequencer, this one here, an amazing sequencer you should all experiment with, right? And this is going, again, for modulation, we use the CV to MIDI CC, going to channel 3, right? So here we can see this CC0, and it's modulating the cutoff point, really easy, really intuitive. Bitwig is just awesome. Right, and I have here another voice, an arpeggio with lots of modulation coming from VCV Rec. Right, I have here in VCV, I have the PGMR sequencer from Bog Audio, which has 4 rows. I'm also using sample and hold. You can see I'm using again the CV to MIDI CC, channel 4 in this case. And here with the Polymer synthesizer, you can see all of the modulation, modulating all sorts of different things. And everything together will sound like this. And as I mentioned, we can also use VCV Rec to process sounds coming from Bitwig. So here I have the polysynth. I'm just playing it with my MIDI keyboard, nothing special, right? And now I can add an effects to it. And we have the VCV Rec 2 effects. So this is a VST effects and not a VST instrument. Right, and now as soon as I add it again, it will load the template. We don't need all of those modules. We need just the audio module. And now because I have it as an effects, if I play now, you see I get no sound because the sound is not going back into Bitwig, and it's only going now to VCV Rec. So in order to have the sound again, I can just send the outputs to the inputs. And now we have the sound. And of course, now I can add a whole chain of modules, modulation, whatever I want. For example, if I want to use a filter in VCV, right, I can use a filter from VCV. This is a stereo filter, right? So the sound will go from the outputs into the filter and from the filter back to the inputs. And now, if I want, of course, I can use a filter, for example. I can use a delay, the lovely Chronoblob 2 from All Right Devices, right? I can create chains like this. Right? And of course, we can use also plateau, which is one of the best reverbs out there, never mind in VCV or out, right? And you can create stuff like this. Just send your audio. Right, you have even level control if you need. Right, so like this you can process the sounds in VCV Rec, create modular effects, modular chains. You can add modulation to everything. So let's really have a look at a more advanced example. So here what I have two send channels with send effects. The first one has plateau on it. So I have plateau as a send effect, right? I just add it, as you can see. I just send the audio from the audio module to plateau and then back to the audio module. And now I can send different tracks into it as a send effect, which is quite amazing. And I have another track here with a delay with Chronoblob 2, but this is also going through the Briatus from Volt for some saturation. And again, you can create whole effect chains, crazy chains. Just remember to use the VCV Rec 2 effects, right, to process sounds. So I have two send effects tracks, and here I have a voice. I have the phase 4 as a sort of, not a sort of, but as a pad. It's going also through more processing in VCV Rec, but let's listen to it first before with some send reverb. Right, again, going to plateau. And now in VCV Rec, I have here the shape master from MindMeld. Now this is basically a multi-stage envelope generator that you can use for all sorts of different things, modulation, gating, and all sorts of different interesting applications. Here I'm using it to basically add rhythm to this pad. So if I activate, right? So now this pad voice is going again through the audio module, going to ShapeMaster and then back to the audio module. So I'm processing this pad through the ShapeMaster. I also have here some drums just for context. Right, and I have here a cello that I'm using the cello from Felt Instruments, highly recommended. Right, and this is going through more processing, and in VCV Rec I have clouds, the texture synthesizer. So basically I have this cello going through clouds in Bitwig, which is quite amazing. I also have sound effects here, the reverb, plateau, and the delay. Right, so if I unmute this, let's wait for it. cello is going through clouds in VCV Rack. VCV Rack processing the sounds. Quite amazing. Right, and that was it, more or less. If you have any questions, requests, comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section. And that's it. I hope it was helpful. Thank you for watching. Have fun. Cheers.